The gunshot echoed in broad daylight. Not in a dark alley. Not in the middle of chaos, but on a quiet street where kids rode bikes and parents waved from porches. 16-year-old Malik stood frozen, hands halfway raised, asking one simple question. What did I do? He never got an answer. 1 second later, he was bleeding on the pavement while the sun kept shining like nothing was wrong. Phones were recording, neighbors were screaming, and the officer already had his story ready. What no one knew in that moment was that the boy they left for dead was the son of a man trained to command silence in war zones. And before this day was over, power would shift, not through violence, but through truth. The sound came first. Sharp, loud, final. A crack that split the bright afternoon in half. For one frozen second, the world stopped breathing, and a boy's life tilted toward something it could never come back from. The sun was high in the sky, bold and unforgiving, pouring light onto a quiet suburban street that had never known chaos like this before. It was the kind of street where lawns were trimmed every Saturday morning, where mailboxes leaned slightly from age, where neighbors waved without thinking and kids rode bikes until dinner was called. Nothing dangerous ever happened here, not in broad daylight, not under a sky this blue. And yet, that was exactly what made it worse. The brightness didn't soften the moment, it exposed it. The police cruiser came out of nowhere, screaming into the block like it had been chasing something evil. Tires burned against the asphalt, leaving black marks that would stay long after the blood was washed away. A sudden noise snapped heads toward the street. Porch doors opened. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Birds scattered from a nearby tree, wings flapping hard as if even they sensed something was wrong. Then silence fell. Heavy, thick, the kind that presses on your chest. 16-year-old Malik stood on the sidewalk, his world shrinking to the space between himself and the uniformed man stepping out of the car. Malik had been walking home from the corner store, backpack slung over one shoulder, mind somewhere between homework and the text he planned to send his friend later. He hadn't been thinking about danger. He hadn't been thinking about police. He had been thinking about how hot it was and how much longer until he could get inside and drop his bag. When the cruiser stopped, Malik froze without knowing why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something black parents teach without ever putting it into words. His feet stayed planted. His shoulders tightened. His hands lifted halfway, unsure of what the right position even was anymore. His backpack slipped down his arm, heavy with books, tugging him slightly off balance. His heart began to beat faster, not from guilt, but from confusion. He hadn't done anything. He ran through the last 10 minutes in his head searching for a mistake. He hadn't crossed against the light. He hadn't said a word to anyone. He had just been walking. The officer didn't greet him, didn't ask his name, didn't explain why he was there. The officer's jaw was tight, clenched like something inside him was already decided. One hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching. His eyes were locked on Malik, not curious, not calm, but sharp. Suspicious. As if Malik himself was the problem standing in the sunlight. Malik swallowed. His mouth was dry. His chest felt tight. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking just enough to give away his fear. "What did I do?" The words hung in the air, unanswered. Neighbors began to gather, pulled by the sound of the cruiser and the tension they could feel without seeing. A woman stepped onto her porch, shading her eyes with her hand. A man paused while watering his lawn, the hose still running, water pooling at his feet. Someone across the street lifted a phone, not sure yet what they were recording, only that something told them they should. Someone whispered it, soft but clear enough to carry. "He's just a kid." The officer took a step closer. Too close. Close enough that Malik could see the small crease between the officer's eyebrows, could smell the leather and sweat and something else. Fear. Not Malik's fear. The officer's. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, flashing briefly like a warning. Power radiated from it, heavy and absolute. This was a man trained to control situations, to command obedience. But there was something else there too, something shaky. Authority sharpened by panic instead of reason. "Don't move," the officer barked. His voice shook. Not much. But enough. Malik's hands lifted higher without thinking. His arms began to ache almost immediately, muscles tight with effort and terror. He nodded quickly, eager to show he was listening, eager to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not moving," Malik said. "I'm not." His eyes darted around, taking in the crowd that was growing by the second. Faces he recognized. Mrs. Turner from down the street, a man he had waved to just yesterday. They all looked different now, helpless, afraid. The officer's hand was fully on the gun now. Malik felt his phone buzz in his pocket. It was nothing, just a vibration. Probably his mother checking if he was on his way home, probably a friend asking about homework. In any other moment it wouldn't have mattered at all. But in this moment, it was everything. The officer's eyes widened just slightly, his body tensing like a wire pulled too tight. His mind filled in the blanks before reality had a chance to catch up. "Don't reach," the officer shouted. "I'm not—" Malik started, panic flooding his voice. Everything happened in 1 second. A shout from the crowd, a sharp inhale from someone too close, a hand moving where it shouldn't have moved. The trigger was pulled. The sound ripped through the street like thunder, loud enough to echo off houses, loud enough to make people flinch and cover their ears. It didn't sound real. It sounded like something from a movie, something that should have stayed fictional. Time stopped. Malik felt the impact before he felt the pain. A hard punch to his chest that knocked the air out of him, that stole his breath so completely he couldn't even scream. His legs gave out beneath him, folding like they no longer belonged to him. He hit the pavement hard, the world tilting sideways as the sky spun above him. The sun was still shining. That was the strangest part. Everything looked the same, bright and normal, even as something terrible was happening. Then the pain came, white hot, blinding. The crowd erupted. Someone screamed his name. A woman's voice, sharp with terror, cut through the noise. Someone dropped a phone, the screen cracking against the sidewalk. Another person shouted for an ambulance. A child began to cry. Blood spread across Malik's shirt, dark and fast, soaking into the fabric as if the ground itself was trying to pull it away from him. The red looked almost unreal against the bright colors of his clothes, against the pale gray of the concrete. The officer stood frozen. His gun was still raised, smoke curling faintly from the barrel. His eyes were locked on Malik. Wide now, his face drained of color. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't seem to breathe. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In his mind, the story had been simple, a threat neutralized, a dangerous moment handled. But the boy on the ground didn't look like a threat. He looked small, young, broken. The officer's hands began to shake. Someone shouted, "You shot him!" Another voice yelled, "He didn't have anything!" The officer didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him all at once, heavy and suffocating. Training didn't cover this part. There was no script for the moment after. Malik lay on the pav. Emmett, gasping weakly, each breath a struggle, his vision blurred. Faces leaned over him, mouths moving, words slipping past him like water. He wanted to say something, to tell them he was scared, to tell his mom he was sorry for not coming straight home. But no sound came out. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with every second. Red and blue lights reflected off windows and car doors, flashing wildly against the calm of the neighborhood. The officer finally lowered his gun. He took a step back, then another, as if the space between him and Malik might somehow erase what had happened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Whatever certainty he had arrived with was gone, replaced by something cold and hollow. He didn't know yet. He didn't know that Malik's father was already on his way. He didn't know that the boy bleeding on the pavement was the son of a man trained to command silence in war zones, a man whose authority stretched far beyond this quiet street. He didn't know what kind of power had just been awakened, not through anger or revenge, but through truth and consequence. He didn't know that this moment, caught in full daylight, by trembling hands and phone cameras, would travel far beyond this neighborhood, far beyond this city. He didn't know that the sound of that single shot would echo long after the sirens faded, long after the blood was washed away, long after the street returned to its careful calm. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again, and as Malik lay there fighting for breath under the open sky, the world held its breath too, waiting to see what would come next. Sirens cut through the air before anyone offered a single answer. Loud, urgent, too late. The sound rolled down the street in waves, bouncing off houses and parked cars, forcing everyone to face what had just happened. Red and blue lights flooded the block, washing over the crowd, over the officer, over Malik's still body lying on the pavement like he had been placed there instead of dropped. Paramedics rushed in fast, their movements sharp and practiced, voices tight with focus. They knelt beside Malik, cutting away his shirt, pressing hands against his chest, calling out numbers and commands to each other that meant nothing to the people watching. Malik didn't move. His eyes were half open but unfocused, staring at nothing. The sun beat down without mercy, lighting up the blood that stained the street, spreading beneath him like a message no one wanted to read, but no one could ignore. Police tape went up almost immediately. Yellow lines stretched across driveways and sidewalks, separating neighbors from their own street, turning a familiar place into a crime scene. People were pushed back gently at first, then firmly. Phones stayed raised. No one wanted to miss what came next. No one trusted that the truth would survive without witnesses. The officer stood a few feet away, staring at Malik as paramedics worked. His face was pale now, his jaw locked so tight it looked painful. In his head, words were already lining up, rehearsing themselves over and over, faster than his heart could slow down. He reached for something. I feared for my life. I followed procedure. The sentences felt safe, clean, familiar. He had heard them before. He had said them before, even if never like this. They formed a shield around him, something he could hide behind while the world tried to make sense of the mess on the ground. A senior officer arrived and placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the scene. Quiet words were exchanged, instructions given. The tone was calm, professional, almost gentle. No one raised their voice at him. No one asked how a boy ended up bleeding in broad daylight. Body cameras were mentioned. Statements would be taken. Everything would be reviewed. The system was already moving, just not for Malik. At the hospital, the smell hit first. Sharp, clean, too clean. Malik's mother ran through automatic doors that slid open without care, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She had been called with words that didn't make sense yet. There had been an incident. There had been a mistake. There had been a shooting. She didn't remember dropping her keys, didn't remember sitting down. She remembered the nurse holding a bag out to her. Careful, almost apologetic. Inside the bag were Malik's clothes, blood-soaked, cut open, heavy with what they represented. Her knees gave out before she could make a sound. She collapsed into the hallway, hands clutching the fabric like it could still hold her son together. Her cry broke free then, loud and raw, echoing down the sterile walls of the hospital. It was the sound of a mother losing the future she had imagined just hours earlier. People stared. Some looked away. No officer stepped forward to explain. No apology came. No one knelt beside her to say they were sorry. She was surrounded by professionals trained to handle emergencies, but no one knew what to do with this kind of pain. Malik was rushed into surgery. Doors closed. Lights above the hallway flickered softly. Time slowed to a crawl that felt like punishment. Outside, the officer sat alone in his cruiser. The engine idled. The air conditioner hummed. His hands rested on his thighs, trembling now, not from guilt, but from something closer to fear. Not fear of what he had done, but fear of what might happen next. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up instantly, flooded with notifications, messages, alerts, mentions. Videos already circulating. The angle wasn't flattering. The sound was clear, unarmed, daylight shooting, another black teen. His chest tightened. This wasn't staying local. This wasn't going away quietly. Inside the precinct, conversations moved quickly but carefully. Doors closed, papers shuffled. A quiet urgency filled the air. Officers spoke in low voices, choosing words that would protect the department before they protected the truth. He had a clean record. It was a split-second decision, a tragic situation, but justified. The phrases landed softly, repeated until they sounded believable. The narrative took shape, polished and ready to present. This wasn't about Malik anymore. It was about managing damage. Malik became a name on a report, a case number, a situation to contain. By sunset, the street looked different. Candles lined the sidewalk where Malik had fallen. Wax melted into the cracks, pooling on concrete still warm from the sun. Handwritten signs leaned against trees and fences, their messages simple and desperate. Justice for Malik. He was just a kid. People gathered as the sky dimmed, their faces lit by candlelight and phone screens. Chants rose slowly at first, then stronger, louder, filling the air with anger and grief braided together. Say his name. No justice, no peace. Cars slowed as they passed. Some drivers honked in support. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet the eyes of the crowd. The department responded with silence. No press conference. No statement that carried weight. Just carefully worded lines released online, empty of emotion and heavy with legal caution. Inside the hospital, Malik's mother sat slumped in a chair, her eyes fixed on the closed doors that Sipa raided her from her son. Time had lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Every sound made her jump. Every passing doctor felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. When the surgeon finally appeared, his face was tired but focused. She stood so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "He's alive," he said. The words hit her like air after drowning. Relief crashed through her body, so strong it almost hurt. But it didn't bring peace. Not yet. Not with so much still unanswered. Outside, as the protest continued, a man stood at the edge of the crowd. He didn't hold a sign. He didn't chant. He didn't record. He stood still. He wore plain clothes, jeans, a simple shirt. Nothing about him drew attention at first glance. But his posture did, straight, controlled, the kind of stillness that came from years of discipline. His hands rested calmly at his sides. His eyes didn't wander. They stayed locked on the hospital entrance across the street. This was Malik's father. He had arrived quietly, slipping into the crowd without announcement. He had seen the videos, heard the sirens, felt the shock settle deep in his chest long before his feet touched the pavement. He didn't shout Malik's name into the night. He didn't collapse. He didn't demand answers from the nearest officer. He watched. He took in every detail. The police presence. The distance they kept from the crowd. The way the narrative was already being shaped in real time. He had seen this before, just in different uniforms in different places, under different flags. War taught him patience. Experience taught him timing. Inside him something burned. Not rage, not yet. Something colder, sharper. A resolve built on understanding systems and how they moved, how they protected themselves, how they could be forced, change. He knew shouting would get him nothing. He knew threats would only close doors. So he wait. The officer, unaware of the man watching him from across the street, finally left the precinct that night under cover of darkness. His name wasn't released. His face was blurred in official statements. He went home to a quiet house, replaying the moment over and over, wondering if the words he had practiced would be enough to save him. In the hospital, Malik lay unconscious, machines humming softly around him, each beep a reminder that he was still here, that he had survived something he never should have faced. His father stood outside the room for a long time before going in. When he did, he didn't cry. He took Malik's hand gently, feeling the warmth there, grounding himself in it. "I'm here," he said softly, though Malik couldn't hear him. Outside, the protests grew. The story spread, the pressure mounted, and still the system stayed quiet. But the man who knew how systems worked was no longer standing on the outside. He was watching and waiting. And the silence that surrounded the department, that protected the officer, that tried to swallow Malik's name, was about to meet something far more dangerous than noise. It was about to meet truth, armed with patience and power that didn't need to announce itself. The night stretched on, heavy with unanswered questions, and as the city tried to sleep, one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not even close. Morning came softly, as if the world itself was afraid to be loud after what had happened. Sunlight poured through the hospital windows in long, pale streaks, landing on white floors and quiet faces. The night had been endless, heavy with fear and waiting, but now the day arrived carrying news that balanced on the edge between hope and heartbreak. Malik survived. Barely. The words moved through the family like air returning to lungs that had been held too long. The doctor spoke carefully, his tone steady but serious. The bullet had missed Malik's heart by inches. Inches. A word so small, yet so powerful it made everyone in the room shiver. Inches were the difference between a boy breathing and a mother planning a funeral. Inches were the space between life and silence. Machines hummed beside Malik's bed, steady and patient. Tubes ran from his body, each one a reminder that survival didn't mean safety, not yet. His chest rose and fell, slow but real. His face was pale, his body still, but he was alive. And for a moment that was enough to make tears fall and hands clasp together in relief. But peace did not come with the good news. Relief softened the edges of fear, but anger still lived in the room, questions still pressed in. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And what would happen next? Outside the hospital, reporters gathered as the morning wore on. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Voices buzzed with speculation. The story had grown overnight. It was no longer just a local shooting. It was a symbol, another name added to a list no one wanted to keep extending. At the police department, the mood was tense. Phones rang non-stop. Emails stacked up faster than they could be answered. The mayor wanted answers. City officials wanted distance. The media wanted blood, or at least accountability. An emergency meeting was called, and the air inside the conference room felt thick with pressure before anyone even spoke. The officer sat stiffly in his chair, hands folded tight in his lap. He hadn't slept. Dark circles framed his eyes. He had rehearsed his words again and again, smoothing them until they sounded reasonable even to himself. He expected the same support he had felt the night before, the same quiet nods, the same reassurance that things would be handled. Then the door opened. A man walked in slowly, calmly, dressed in plain clothes. No uniform, no badge, no visible weapon, just presence, the kind that didn't announce itself but still commanded the room. Every commanding officer stood instantly. Chairs scraped back. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The sudden movement snapped the officer's head up, confusion flashing across his face. He had never seen this before, never felt the room shift so quickly. "Sir," someone said, voice sharp with respect. The man nodded once, acknowledging the room without claiming it. His eyes were steady, scanning faces, taking everything in. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, even controlled. "My name is Colonel David Harris," he said. "I lead Joint Special Forces operations for this region." The room went silent. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that settles deep in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The officer's heart began to race. He had heard the name before. Not personally, but enough to know what it meant. This wasn't just another official. This was someone who lived above the usual lines of authority. Someone whose power didn't need a badge to be recognized. Colonel Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it gently on the table, sliding it across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of the officer. It was Malik, smiling, young, proud, the kind of smile that came from believing the world was still mostly good. A graduation photo, cap tilted just slightly, eyes bright with plans not yet lived. "That's my son," Colonel Harris said. The color drained from the officer's face. His mouth opened, then closed again. Whatever words he had practiced vanished. The story he had rehearsed no longer fit the moment. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls had moved in. Colonel Harris didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He didn't threaten anyone in the room. He didn't have to. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had commanded lives and missions in places far more dangerous than this conference room. Someone who understood rules, protocols, and the weight of decisions made in seconds. "You fired without confirmation," he said evenly, "in daylight, on a child." The words landed hard. He continued, laying out details with precision. Protocol failures, use of force violations, psychological profiling errors that never should have happened. He referenced standards used in the military, rules stricter than any local police policy, rules designed to prevent exactly this kind of mistake. Each sentence stripped away another layer of protection. The officer shifted in his seat, sweat forming at his temples. He tried to interrupt once, but Colonel Harris raised a single hand. Not aggressive, not angry, just final. "Fear is not an excuse," he said. "Assumption is not training." No one argued. Every excuse collapsed under the weight of facts and authority that couldn't be ignored or buried. The commanding officers glanced at each other, their expressions tight. They understood what this meant. This wasn't going to disappear. This wasn't going to be managed quietly. By that afternoon, body cam footage was released. The truth spilled out into the open, raw and undeniable. The video showed Malik standing still, hands up, confused, afraid. The sound of the shot echoed through screens across the country, making people flinch in their living rooms, in break rooms, in offices where silence followed. There was no reaching, no threat, no justification. The narrative shattered. By sunset, the department could no longer hide behind silence. The officer was suspended. Charges were announced. Press conferences were held, words carefully chosen but heavy with consequence. Officials spoke about accountability, about transparency, about learning lessons. The crowd outside the precinct grew larger, louder, but the anger shifted. This time there was something else in the air. Not victory, not yet, but acknowledgement. Power had shifted, not through violence, Not through rage, but through dignity and truth. Colonel Harris left the building the same way he had entered, quietly, without ceremony. Cameras tried to follow him, microphones pushed forward, questions shouted into the air. He didn't stop. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. At the hospital, Malik's family watched the news on a small screen mounted in the corner of the waiting room. When the announcement came, Malik's mother closed her eyes and let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It didn't heal her son. It didn't erase the scar that would follow him for life, but it told her that what happened mattered, that her child wasn't being erased. Inside his room, Malik slept on, unaware of the storm his name had stirred, unaware of the power his survival had awakened. His father sat beside him, hand resting gently on the bed rail, eyes watching the slow rise and fall of his son's chest. He thought about inches, about timing, about how close the world had come to stealing something it had no right to take. He also thought about restraint, about the strength it took to stand still when everything inside you wanted to explode, about the kind of power that didn't shout, didn't strike, didn't rush. The officer, at home now, watched the same news in stunned silence. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't open. The badge that once felt like armor now felt heavy, distant. The story he had practiced was gone, replaced by footage he couldn't argue with. For the first time, he saw Malik not as a threat, not as a shape in his fear, but as a boy. Someone's son, someone's future. The day ended the way it began, with light fading and shadows stretching long across the city. But something had changed beneath the surface. A line had been crossed, then redrawn, because sometimes power doesn't look like force. Sometimes it looks like a name spoken calmly in a room that expects silence. Sometimes it looks like truth walking in unarmed and still taking control. And as night fell, one lesson lingered in the air, heavy and clear. Real authority isn't about who pulls the trigger. It's about who has the courage to stop everything, stand tall, and demand that a child's life be treated as sacred. Weeks later, the street looked the same, and that was the strangest part of all. The sun rose and settled into the sky like it always had, bright and confident, spilling light over quiet homes that lined the block with their familiar shapes and colors. Lawns were trimmed again. Mailboxes stood straight. Cars were parked neatly along the curb. To anyone passing through, it looked like nothing had ever happened here. But the people who lived on that street knew better. Fresh flowers were tied carefully around a lamppost near the corner, their petals soft and bright where candles had once burned low into the night. The wax had been scraped away, the chalk messages washed clean by rain, but memory doesn't fade as easily as evidence. Every neighbor knew exactly where Malik had fallen. They could see it even without looking. It lived in the silence between greetings, in the way people paused just a second longer before waving, in the way parents now watch their children walk home. Malik walked slowly down that same sidewalk one afternoon, sunlight warming his shoulders. His steps were careful, measured, not because he was weak, but because his body was still learning its limits again. The scar was visible now, peeking out from the collar of his shirt, a thin line that told a story words never could. It caught the light sometimes, drawing eyes, but Malik didn't hide it. His head was held high. There was something different in the way he carried himself. Not louder, not harder, just steadier. He had seen how quickly the world could turn cold. He had felt how fragile life really was. And somehow, instead of shrinking him, it had anchored him. Across town, in a courtroom filled with polished wood and quiet tension, the officer stood where Malik once had stood on the street. Exposed, watched, stripped of everything that once made him feel untouchable. There was no badge on his chest now, no uniform to signal authority. Just a man in plain clothes, hands clasped tightly in front of him, waiting for words that could not be taken back. The room was silent as the judge entered. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. Journalists sat in the back, pens ready but unmoving. Malik and his family sat together, close enough to feel each other breathe. Colonel Harris sat beside them, calm and still, his posture unchanged by the setting. The officer looked up once. His eyes met Malik's, just for a second. In that moment, something shifted inside him, something he had avoided since the day of the shooting. Malik wasn't a headline here, wasn't footage on a screen. He was real, breathing, watching, alive despite everything. Then the officer's gaze moved to Colonel Harris, and understanding finally settled in. Not every threat wears a hoodie. Not every authority wears a badge. And not every man without visible power is powerless. The judge spoke, voice firm, steady, each word landing with intention. Charges were read, consequences named. The law, slow and imperfect, did what it was supposed to do this time. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just accountability delivered plainly. When it was over, the officer sat down slowly, shoulders sagging as if a weight he had carried for weeks had finally been set down. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defiant. He looked smaller, human, a man forced to live with the echo of a choice made in fear. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, questions were shouted, opinions thrown into the air like sparks. Colonel Harris walked past it all without stopping. He didn't raise his hand, didn't offer a statement. He had never wanted the spotlight. What he wanted couldn't be captured in a soundbite. He wanted change. Behind closed doors, meetings followed, not loud ones, serious ones. Training policies were reviewed line by line, oversight tightened, use of force guidelines rewritten with clarity that left less room for assumption and fear. Officers were retrained to slow down, to assess, to remember the weight of their decisions. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was movement. A department had been forced to look at itself in the daylight, and it couldn't unsee what it saw. Malik returned to school that fall. The hallways looked the same, but he felt different walking through them. Friends stared, unsure of what to say. Teachers offered gentle smiles that carried more concern than usual. Some people treated him like he was fragile, others like he was a symbol. Malik didn't want to be either. He wanted to be a kid again. There were days when the scar ached, when memories crept in uninvited, when sudden noises made his heart race before he could stop it. But there were also days filled with laughter, with plans, with moments that reminded him why surviving mattered. People watched him more closely now, listened when he spoke. He noticed it. The weight of attention sat on his shoulders sometimes, heavy and strange. But he also noticed something else. His voice carried further. When he talked about what happened, people leaned in instead of away. When he asked questions, they were answered. Pain had given him something he never asked for, but learned to use carefully. At home, Malik's mother slept better now, though she still woke sometimes in the night, reaching out just to be sure her son was still there. Each morning she watched him leave for school. With a prayer she never skipped, even when she was late. Colonel Harris returned to his work quietly, missions planned, meetings attended, responsibilities carried. He never gave interviews, never stood on stages. The men and women who worked with him noticed something, though, a sharper edge to his focus, a deeper patience. He spoke more often about restraint, about judgment, about the lives behind the silhouettes. Some listened more closely than they ever had before. The street where it all began settled back into routine. Children rode bikes again, neighbors chatted over fences. But every so often, someone would pause near the lamppost, fingers brushing the cool metal, remembering what had been tied there once. The world hadn't magically healed. Injustice didn't disappear. Fear didn't vanish. Another headline would come, another story, another name. But something had shifted, small but real. This time, daylight had exposed the truth, not buried it, and that mattered, because silence, when chosen with intention, had proven stronger than shouting. Dignity, when held firmly, had proven more powerful than rage. And a boy who had been almost erased had become a reminder that life, even when scarred, still carried meaning. The lesson traveled far beyond that quiet street. It echoed in classrooms, in precincts, in homes where parents held their children a little tighter. It lingered in conversations where assumptions were questioned instead of accepted. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never judge worth by appearance. And never forget, real power isn't pulling a trigger. It's having the discipline not to, because in the end, the strongest force in that story wasn't a gun, a badge, or a uniform. It was the courage to see another human being clearly, in the brightest light of day, and choose restraint over fear. That was the lesson left behind. And as one the world could not afford to forget.